Many people don't know the Beatles could not read or write music, as was the case with a lot of these bands in the early 60s. And so everything was done by ear. And what's interesting with the Beatles is they were always trying to find some new chord or stumble upon some new fingering, whether it was a guitar or whether it was a piano, an instrument they were less comfortable with. And sometimes they would stumble on a chord and they would say, that's great, let's use that. They did it in I Want to Hold Your Hand, as a matter of fact. John and Paul were sitting at the piano writing the song. Paul plays a minor chord that was sort of out of the blue, and John says, that was great, what was that? Let's get that down. And that's how the writing process worked. It wasn't so much writing out a chord chart or having some preconceived notion. It was what sounded good. And the Beatles always wanted to surprise you. They wanted to take you someplace different with their chords and then bring you back to someplace you felt comfortable. And it's completely subconscious if you don't know anything about music, but it works really well. It's why their songs last so well today. I think one of the interesting things about the Beatles was they listened to everything. So they listened to jazz music, some of the crooners, they listened to skiffle music, they listened to early American rock and roll. It all seeped in and influenced the Beatles. When they met George Martin was a classically trained musician. He really didn't have a lot of experience with skiffle or with rock and roll or anything like that. So his influence on the Beatles was to help to tighten their sound and add in sort of classical arrangements. So you start to hear that really coming into play with a song like Yesterday, which was 1965. And then as the Beatles get more advanced in their songwriting and more advanced in their instrumentation, start to explore the studio, you see more piano coming in as well. Sometimes played by George Martin, sometimes played by one of the Beatles. One of the great things about classic rock is the idea of always trying to push the limits in terms of instrumentation, arrangements, and so forth. And one of the things that happened in the late 50s, 60s was this idea of adding distortion to a recording. And it was not something that was commonplace, but there was a song that came out by Bobby Sox called Zippity Doo Dah. Phil Spector produced it, and the guitarist on that song had accidentally distorted his guitar. Phil Spector decided to leave that in the recording. Everyone heard that and they wanted that sound. And so guitar manufacturers were trying to make distortion pedals. Some, like Vox, who made a lot of the Beatles equipment, were very reluctant to come out with a distortion pedal because they thought, why would you want to add distortion? Everyone's trying to get rid of distortion in recordings. But they did make one, and the Beatles either used one made by Vox or one made by a guy named Gary Hurst called a tone bender, and it was used on a song called Think for Yourself with Paul's bass. So on Rubber Soul, Think for Yourself has a normal bass, and it has the bass through this tone bender, which creates a distorted bass sound, a very unusual effect for the time. The Beatles existed in a moment of time where everyone was tuned in to one of a few radio stations, one of a few TV channels. You had a lot of cultural change going on in the 60s, and it was the right place, right time. And you had a group with three very strong songwriters that had honed their craft through thousands and thousands of hours of playing. And you just don't get that these days. We are so fragmented in our rock and roll. One person's classic rock is another person's, heavy metal or country rock or what have you. It's all very fragmented. And the Beatles were, for a moment in time, they were the focus of anyone who liked popular music. There are a lot of factors that are changing the way music is made and the way music is distributed. Today, most artists are recording using computers, using things like Pro Tools, where they can record 200 tracks without taking up any space on their hard disk. They can go back and pick the ones they like. They can auto-tune. They can decide they want to change out the piano for an organ. That's all done after the fact. In the Beatles' day, and in the real classic rock era, what you got down to tape, that was it. You could erase it, you could maybe overdub, add something, but you couldn't change the sound after the fact. You had very limited control over that. So I think that's one thing that's a big change, is the way recording is done. A lot of bands don't do this setting up the microphones and record. They do it in the computer. They do it in the box. And the whole way music is distributed, there's none of this waiting for the next Beatles release, which is coming out this day, and we all wait around for it, and then we go to the record store and we buy the vinyl. Nowadays, you have so many different ways of getting music. You have so many different ways of packaging the music. You can buy just one song instead of an album. So it's very, very different than it was, certainly in the late 60s, early 70s. So I remember working on a film score, and I was trying to find the right piano sound for this piece I'd written. And a whole day had gone by, and I realized I still was picking out samples. I hadn't written a note of music, which was very frustrating because you don't get into the creative process that way. It's a different type of creation. It's picking sounds as opposed to writing music. The Beatles didn't have the luxury of doing that. They could try different experiments out in the studio, but their instrumental palette was very limited. The recording technology was extremely limited. And so they had to get something right. And they could overdub, they could add things. As they started getting more advanced in the studio, they could layer and layer and layer. But it was very hard to go back and undo things that they'd already recorded. The only thing they could do is start over again.
So it forced you to be a good musician?
Yeah, it forces you to really be a good musician, to have good ears. It forces the engineers and the producers to make sure the sound is good, because when you start layering instruments, you have this tendency to bury the drums. You know, all of a sudden you lose something, and you can't do that and get a good recording out of it. I think rock and roll music, just like all music, has been on a trajectory. You know, you can say Beethoven learned from Haydn, and Mozart, who learned from Bach, and Bartok learned from them. I mean, there's a lineage. There's a lineage in jazz, and there's certainly a lineage in rock and roll. What happened, I think, is that we had a very direct line from the blues to early rock and roll, and then largely with the Beatles, things started to fragment. And you had people going in a more, in the Steely Dan vein, and you had the brass vein, and the soul, and the funk, and country, and things started to spread. And of course now with hip hop, and there's so many different schools of hip hop and so forth. So I think music will continue to evolve. What will be considered classic rock in the future? Who knows? I do think there are good singer-songwriters today. I do think there are good bands today. I think the difference is that it's much, much easier to create music. The barrier to entry is a lot lower. You can create something in your bedroom using Ableton Live or using Reason or using a limited version of Pro Tools, and you can tweak it and tune it, and if your drum beats are off or your guitar is out of tune or your vocals is off, you can change all of that. And so the level of musicianship required to make a good recording changes. It becomes the technique. It becomes technology-based as opposed to creative songwriting. In the Beatles' day and in most of the classic rock era, you didn't have the luxury of being able to fix things after the fact. And so that's the major change. But I don't think that there's a lack of good songwriters. I don't think there's a lack of good musicians. There are some amazing, amazing players out there today. But I do think that the world isn't focused on them like we were focused on the Beatles and the Stones and the groups of the time. There are bands that have very good musicians. They have very creative songwriting and arranging techniques, and they're bringing in everything they've learned from the classic rock era as well as from world music and classical and jazz. They're doing exactly what the Beatles did back in the 60s. But right now, you can have your choice of 3,000 different radio stations, internet stations, Spotify, Pandora. You don't have, the AM station that's playing the top 40 hits. So your chances of stumbling on these bands is much more difficult.
People still believe in the power of rock and roll music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.
I hate that guitar, but I can play that in one scale.
Don't you dare laugh.
I try to embrace the rock and roll spirit in the sense of I do everything self-funded and independently made with no oversight. As such, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for watching.